Hello and welcome to another War of the Yokai reading. This is the fourth chapter, I believe. And this totally isn't my second recording, as the first one was interrupted by my phone going off from a spam caller. No, not at all. A quick little reminder of what these are. These are the audiobook type recordings of my books for those who are perhaps visually impaired or just don't have the time to read them in my Discord server. Admittedly, the Discord, the font is a little tricky. It's a little small. So, this is, and like I said, maybe there's people who, they don't have the time to read it in person, but maybe they're working and they want to listen to it. So, this is for you. This is the fourth chapter of book 3. I'm going to read just a little bit because of how I ended the last one. It was in the way the new chapter kind of starts. I feel it's necessary to kind of do the final paragraphs of the last book. So, I would say maybe skip ahead a minute and a half or so if you remember what happened. If not, enjoy. Lydia then went on to relay everything she'd been told, not leaving out even a single detail. Christina's eyebrows raised in surprise, but she kept her tone professional as she replied. Roger that. If you'd like, I can try swimming there and delivering it in person if it's that urgent. Over. A pause, as Lydia seemed to be mulling over the offer. Christina knew she could likely handle the sea critters easily enough, and with Madrid still on the line, she could tell the Kraken guard to let her pass. Only if you think it's safe. You know what lurks over there at night. Over. I've eaten worse, she replied with a smirk, before elaborating on how she'd need Madrid to vouch for her. As she stripped down to nothing and made her way to the edge of the deck before leaping off, she couldn't help but grin widely. Her day just got a whole lot more fun. She'd definitely be able to track the team easily enough, so long as the Oni were still with them. They had such a unique scent. One of those very Oni, Ray in fact, was at present fending off a carnivorous armadillo the size of a tractor trailer. It had ambushed both her and Hyoka as the two had paired off to explore and get to know each other a bit more. Already they'd each found a totem, thanks to the frost web technique Hyoka had created. It allowed her to create a very thin layer of frost and then, by tapping her consciousness into the ice for the briefest of moments, essentially use echolocation to find any nearby anomalies. Though they hadn't reacted at all when the girls initially picked them up, when Ray took hold of the one Hyoka had grabbed, she'd nearly gone blind. The sunlight had intensified by 1,000-fold. Ray screamed and immediately threw it down, her vision going back to normal, though she had a big dark spot in the middle of her field of view now. That new blind spot was what had allowed the creature, an Azotodon, which had been burrowed down waiting for prey, to ambush them. Hyoka's frost web had irritated it, and when the red Oni stepped on its shell, it decided she'd make a tasty nibble and attacked. Ray summoned her... Oh. Continuity error. I need to fix that. Ray summoned her kanabo and started beating it over the head, though the armored shell made it about as effective as hitting a snapping turtle with a stick. Hold on, I'm going to reread that, because that's a continuity error I'm realizing I did not fix. Oh, dummy. Ray grabbed a massive tree limb, there we go, and started beating it over the head, though the armored shell made it about as effective as hitting a snapping turtle with a stick. Hyoka, worried Ray might end up being the Azotodon's next meal, began calling on her powers in order to send a blast of freezing wind at it. She knew that, as a being used to living in tropical temperatures, a good blast of winter snow should make it turn tail. At least, that was her hope. Ray, bring it closer to me and get ready for the cold, yelled Hyoka up to the Oni, who was currently riding the thing like a crazed bull. Easier said than Ray shouted back. You come closer! Not like you can get trampled! Oh, right, duh, sighed Hyoka, floating towards the Azotodon, her hands cupped in front of her chest, as a growing ball of swirling snow and ice became visible in the gap. Have a taste of my, icy wind! No, how about, chill out, Dillosaur! No, that's stupid, quit with the one-liners and, get this thing out of here! Shouted Ray, now holding the thing's jaws open before they could snap shut. She knew if push came to shove, she could go all chest-burster on it to get out, but Ray really didn't want to kill a living creature unless she absolutely had to. Sorry, apologized Hyoka, sending a wall of winter straight at the Azotodon, which immediately loosened its grip on Ray, turned tail, and bounded away like it had been shot. It also had the side effect of freezing several of the nearby trees completely solid. Hyoka still had a lot to learn about controlling her ice powers, it seemed, something that made her afraid to use them at times. Thanks, kid, I owe you one, smiled Ray. Kid? Giggled Hyoka. Ray, I think I'm older than you. I'm 28. You're what? As Usoko continued her search, the Pinkette suddenly felt an odd chill in the air and could have sworn she heard a freight train barreling by somewhere nearby, but just shrugged. This island had so many massive creatures, it was probably just one of them going for a run. Speaking of runs, she was currently teamed with her jogging coach, Sarah. The Banshee was choosing to stay visible this time, though, as opposed to the fog-like form she usually took on, the two's early morning jogs. Oh, sorry. I just got off work, okay? Sue me. The Banshee was choosing to stay visible this time, though, as opposed to the fog-like form she usually took on the two's early morning jogs. This actually made Usoko a little more comfortable, as she was able to know where Sarah was at all times. Hey, Sarah, asked Pinkette as they walked. I got a question. You knew my grandma when she was younger, and said she looked like me, right? Like, how much? How much she looked like ya? Replied Sarah, floating around to get a better look at Usoko's face. Let me see. The eyes are different, not quite as sharp. Angle your jaw forward a bit, though, and it's the same. Nose is identical. Hairstyle, too. Just hers was longer in the back. Other than that, you're her spitting image. Here, try saying something in English for me. How about, we meet again, Banshee? Eh? Well, I'll try. I'm not the best at English anymore, though. Usoko cleared her throat. We meet again, Banshee. The circle is now complete. When we last met, I was but the learner. Now I am the master. Only a master of dorkiness, Usoko, laughed Sarah. But, you sound pretty close. Enough to be eerie. But then, you are related. A moment later, Nonami emerged from the brush, adjusting the skirt she had been forced to swap into after an angry bush they'd encountered earlier had shredded the pants she'd been wearing to ribbons. The skirt was a bit too short for her liking, and its bright green color clashed terribly with the dull, subdued natural colors she was otherwise wearing. Still, the fact that Usoko had learned a spell to magically create clothes out of the ether was certainly a boon not to be wasted. So, beamed the Pinkette, was my clothes beam a success? To a degree, admitted the vampire, though it's a bit large around the hips. I don't suppose you could magic up a belt, You could magic up a belt as well, Smirking, Usoko extended her bat, a yellow-green magical swirl forming at its tip before a thin beam of light struck Nonami's waist, transforming into a belt. Ah, splendid, smiled Nonami. The perfect size, too. As she leaned over to examine the new belt a little closer, Nonami's keen eyes noticed an object on the ground. Kneeling down to pick it up, she realized it was a totem. Ugh, this whole trip has been so shitty. I just want to cuddle with Any-chan. The voice Nonami clearly heard was Usoko's, but her niece's mouth was closed and hadn't moved once. Usoko? She started to ask before looking down at the totem now in her hand. Could it be? Usoko, think something else. What? Asked confused Usoko.
Oh boy, did Aunt Maria just lose it?
No, I assure you I did not, replied Onami, loosening her grip on the totem. I think this one may have telepathy powers. Gripping once more, she turned to Sarah. Sarah, say something only I would know about. Already getting the idea, Sarah only nodded.
You once told me that when you were 5, you almost drowned in the moat, only to be saved by your sister, who you later found out.
Risked her very neck to pluck me out while the sun was up, finished Onami. Yep, telepathy. Oh, great. Now she can read minds, sighed Usoko with a laugh. Her eyes caught sight of something then. In the distance there was what looked to be an ancient stone pyramid, though not like one she'd ever seen in any history book. Hey, what's that? She inquired, pointing to the structure. Looks to be something the ancients built, replied Onami with a shrug. I doubt we'll have time to explore it today. The sun's starting to get low, and I cannot stress enough how much we do not want to be outside when it goes down. We'll try and check it out later, I suppose. Sound like a plan? Odd. She felt a strange compulsion wash over her, like she needed to be there, at the temple. With a shrug, she pushed the feeling down, but the nagging sense just wouldn't go away, until she turned her gaze away from it. Sure, smiled Usoko. We should all check it out together. Who knows what we might find? Upon returning to the cave, the trio found Ray stood outside the mouth in front of a raging bonfire. Currently roasting over said fire was a handmade spit, was the biggest bird Usoko had ever seen. Its wings were nearly as long as Emiko was tall, and its body was about the size and shape of a Volkswagen Beetle. I bagged dinner, cheered the Oni as they came into view. I've never had rock before, but they say it's delicious. Nonami sighed with such gusto that the ground shook from her powers. Ray, there's a reason for that, she groaned. Rocks are incredibly endangered, like everything else on this island. And just author's note, that's rocks spelled R-O-C, not R-O-C-K. That's not like giant flying rocks. It's a type of mythical bird. Anyway, sorry. Usoko could see Ray wince, but the damage was clearly already done. For what it's worth, she offered weakly as an excuse, it did try to eat me first. Inside the cave, they found Emiko knitting leaves, grass, and animal hides into a series of makeshift bedding. And blankets. Oh, typo. And blankets. 2 had already been finished, large ones meant for the Oni, and Emi was nearly done with a much smaller one meant for Usoko. As for Nonami, Ray had already carved her a new coffin earlier and lined it with grass. It wasn't the most comfortable, as Nonami much preferred to lay on her native soil when not at home, but it would suffice for now. The spirits would be keeping guard near the entrance, though according to Nonami's estimates, the opening was too small for any of the nightlife to get in. Still. Wow, you really snazzed this place up, Emi-chan, giggled and impressed Usoko. I didn't know you could sew, let alone do all of this. You like? She asked hesitantly. Truthfully, I'm not the best at it. My skills are mediocre at best. Could have fooled me, winked Usoko, smooching her on the cheek. Mwah. Dinner was served soon after. Roasted rock, with a hint of seasoning from some nearby herbs Ray found and made sure were safe to eat. Usoko found it tasted quite like chicken, though gamier and more chewy. Still, she had to admit it wasn't bad, though she did feel bad about eating an endangered species. Soon after they were done, the last rays of light disappeared over the horizon and darkness began to fall. Quickly, Ray extinguished the fire, hurling the remains of the rock far from the cave before rolling the boulder door partially shut at Nonami's request. Given that whatever dwelled here at night was enough to give Nonami the willies, Usoko was understandably nervous about going to sleep. The main chamber was large enough that everyone's beds were able to be kept distant, though Usoko wanted to stay close to Emiko.
Hey, Emi-chan?
She whispered not long after lights out.
Can I join you? I'm sorry, I'm just a little nervous.
In lieu of a reply, one of Emi's big blue arms extended up, waving her hand for the pinkette to come closer. Usoko's pulse started racing as she laid down, and this was very much not helped when Emiko pulled her close against her a second later. Still, she felt so much safer here in Emiko's arms. Usoko had never cuddled before, and she was quickly finding out she enjoyed it a lot.
Hey, Emi?
She whispered again, as quietly as she could.
This is super nice. I love it. And I love you, too. Good night.
Good night, Uso-chan, mumbled Emiko, her face practically purple from how much she was blushing. From nearby, she could make out the faint giggling of Ray, but other than that, the chamber was quiet, and the two girls quickly fell asleep in each other's arms. The next day, they woke bright and early, everyone a bit stiff from sleeping on the ground, but otherwise ready to meet the day. They would first eat a brief, protein-packed meal for breakfast before Nonami split them into 3 groups. Usoko and Ray, Emiko and Sarah, herself and Hyoka. They would take turns sparring with one another, with the main focus being on using their elemental powers as much as possible.
Hey, go easy on me, all right?
Laughed a slightly afraid Usoko. She knew Ray wouldn't go berserker on her, but she'd seen the Oni in a fight, and Ray in combat was nothing if not absolutely terrifying to Usoko. Their bout was brief as Ray, forgetting she had to use her powers, knocked Usoko out with one punch.
Ah! Usoko! I'm so sorry!
She cried as everyone just rolled their eyes. Fortunately, Ray seemed to have a decent grip on her powers anyway, at least by Nonami's estimation, so their session was moved up to later. Next to fight were Sarah and Emiko, both girls having more than a slight itch to swing at one another, though not out of any mutual dislike. They just had a bit of unsettled business to attend to.
Hey, don't take offense when I blow your arse off your feet, Your Majesty,
taunted Sarah with a coy grin. We'll see who's on whose butt when this is over, Banshee, retorted Emiko right back. In a flash from Sarah's palms rushed a vortex of wind that Emiko just barely managed to dodge before unleashing a barrage of lightning bolts from her fingertips. See how you like my unlimited power! Laughed Emmy, swapping to... Oops, she's not in Oni... Pretend she wasn't in Oni form. Swapping to Oni form. God bless America. Anyway, lightning flashed and winds howled in the chamber as both girls sought to one-up the either, as I wrote. That's another reason I like doing these. I can go back and I'm like, oh, spelling errors. I can fix those. Anyway, it was like someone had dropped a thunderstorm in their midst, and one particular being in the cave was finding it to be most annoying. Lumbering from his crevasse, Steve ambled into the middle of the fray, extending his arms wide and shouting, "Enough!" That was all it took for both combatants to rein their powers in and float back to the ground. By the Great Spirit, he grumbled. When Usoko said you lot would be practicing with your powers, I was expecting... Well, I wasn't expecting this. He leaned against the wall, looking for a moment like his astronomically old age. Where I come from, there were warriors with powers much like your own. Oops, sorry, reread. Where I come from, there were warriors with powers much like yours. I even fought them on occasion. You lack the discipline even the most novice of their number had. Emiko,
You treat your powers like a mighty flowing river. You need to learn how to trickle. Sarah, you are much the same. Your power flows from you, but I have seen little else in the way of control. These abilities, they are a gift to you, and they are far more than mere weapons. Kobayashi, while you control fire and flame, did you know your power can be used to create updrafts? Updrafts that can be used to slow a falling teammate, or even yourself if caught in free fall.
I didn't actually, replied Ray. How do I do that?
I will teach you. All of you in time, sighed Steve. Even though it goes against... Well, no, I suppose it doesn't go against any creative mind. So be it.
Over the course of the next few days, Steve would tell them aspects of their abilities that they had never thought of, such as Emiko being able to electrify certain ferrous stones and metallic objects before hurling them like a lightning grenade. To Ray, he taught her not only the secrets of updrafts, but also how to create only heat without any flame, and how, when working in concert with Nonami, the two could even control a volcano's eruption. A skill which had actually ended up saving all their lives when the island's own volcano decided to wake up one morning. To Hyoka, he admitted there wasn't much he could teach, as she was already very well skilled in using her powers, though he did advise her how out of control she could get. She had accidentally unleashed a mini blizzard on the island while practicing, and froze a good square acre of jungle solid in her panic.
You must focus on the future, as well as the now, Hyoka,
he explained.
See not just what it can do, but what it will do if left unchecked, and focus your mind on keeping it contained.
For Sarah, again, there wasn't much to teach, save for control, as Sarah already knew how to fly, and so didn't need to be told how she could ride on even the gentlest of breezes. Nonami, meanwhile, learned how she could create localized earthquakes. As for Usoko, she was the only one he couldn't help.
While I know a being with your power has existed before, he explained, I never faced off against him. While dangerous, the one thing I cannot emphasize enough is learning to control it. This light power of yours is unique, wild and untamed. If you can control it, make it your own, you will be a frighteningly formidable foe indeed.
By the end of their 5th night, everyone was beginning to feel exhausted. Steve's instruction and the training aside, the food was running low, and nobody was getting good sleep now, especially Ray. The Red Oni was being plagued by nightmares once again, much like she had been in the weeks since the incident. At last, they proved to be too much, and Ray snapped up with a start. Her restlessness had all but destroyed the delicate bedding Emmy had made, and apparently she had dug her claws into the ground at some point, as there were fresh grooves dug into the stone. A strange noise entered her ears then, a faint, musical whistling sound. Silently, she stood up and began making her way towards the cave entrance to try and discover the source. As she neared the stone, an unnaturally long, spectral limb blocked her path. Go in for a walk? Came the voice of Sarah. It's dangerous out there, you know. I'm hearing a weird noise, she said, motioning to her ears. Just curious, I guess. Curiosity killed the cat, chuckled Sarah. I won't stop you, though. If you wish to go outside at night, be me guest. But don't expect me to let you in if you're being chased by something. Ray nodded in understanding, and Sarah's arm retracted back into the shadows from whence it had came. Let me fix that. Warily, the Oni made her way past the boulder and into the cool night air. It was a welcome change from the damp, stale air of the cave, to be sure. Ray loved the night. Always had for some reason. The crispness in the air, the relative quietness the world fell into, broken only by the sounds of nature. On this island, especially, were those noises magnified. In the distance, she could hear something large lumbering through the forest, likely on its way to the watering hole. Looking up, she could see millions of stars, so many more than she'd ever get to see in Fumizaki. She'd seen a sky like this before, but it still never failed to take her breath away. Just how beautiful it could be. So caught up in this was Ray that she hadn't noticed the odd whistling had grown louder, nor had she noticed the glowing pair of orange eyes staring emotionlessly at her. She did notice, however, when the massive, hairy, 10-legged spider lunged at her from the shadows a moment later. A loud shout echoed through the chamber, jolting everyone awake. They all immediately recognized the voice as Ray's and, upon realizing her bed was empty, raced to the cave entrance where there was now a bright glow and a putrid odor wafting. Upon reaching the source, they found Ray, in Shutendoji form, standing over the burning corpse of a 10-legged spider the size of a horse.
"What have you done?"
moaned Nonami.
"That's going to draw them in for miles around."
Ray bowed in apology, a look of consternation on her face.
"I'm really sorry, Nonami. I just heard a noise and had to, check it out."
As Nonami went to approach Ray then, there was a flash of movement from the brush. At first, it seemed like nothing had happened. But when Nonami's head fell from her shoulders and landed with a thud on the ground, everyone immediately freaked out, Usoko most of all. The expression that crossed her face could only be described as distraught hatred as she made eye contact with what had just done the deed. A praying mantis-type creature, roughly as tall as a hummer and twice as long. It licked the vampire's blood off its forelimb as it scuttled towards her unmoving form. In an instant, there was a hole where the mantis's body had been, and it fell over in 2 pieces, very much dead. All eyes went to Usoko, her shotgun aimed squarely at where the creature had stood, its barrel smoking. Once again, her hair had turned pitch black, her eyes now a golden yellow, with skin a deathly pale. Twin black wings spread out as she turned her face to the sky and screamed. At that moment, dozens more of the mantids and spiders emerged and surrounded the girls. Ray, not wanting anything to happen to her friend's body, flung it over her shoulder and ran it inside the cave before returning. Sarah, upon seeing what had happened, unleashed a shriek the likes of which no one present had heard before, fracturing part of the stone walls around her. Hyoka, a little afraid of entering the fray, instead floated between the creatures, recovering Nonami's head. It was odd. Had she just blinked? The ghost attributed it to a grief hallucination and carried it in, setting the head near the body before finally breaking down and crying. Back outside, the fight had begun in earnest. The insects may have had the superior numbers, but the sheer ferocity the 4 girls were exerting was enough to more than even the odds. Even still, for every one of them Ray burned to a crisp, Emiko bashed or fried with lightning, Sarah screeched into dust, or Usoko annihilated with her gun, more kept coming to replace them. Other bugs had appeared as well. Katydids the size of tigers, centipedes the size of commuter trains, and other things that defied description swarmed the area, drawn to the noise and light. It was only a matter of time before the girls were overwhelmed, and even once Hyoka returned to the fray and added her ice powers to the mix. Or even once Hyoka returned and...
"There's just too many of them!" shouted Emiko. "These things don't stop coming!"
"It's a bug hunt!"
cried Hyoka, shattering a spider. "Game over, man! Game over!" "We have to hold out till daylight," yelled Sarah in reply. "These things can't stand the sun." That gave Ray an idea, even in the midst of her rage-fueled breakdown.
"Fires! Get out of range!" she cried. "I'm gonna make a false dawn!"
"That could kill ya!" exclaimed Sarah. "Besides, are you even strong enough to do that yet?"
"I don't know," admitted Ray, but it's like our best bet. Everyone go, now!
Not liking their options, but lacking any others, the rest of the team flew up as the swarm turned on Ray. Everyone, that is, save for Usoko. Together, said Usoko, calling on her spear. You bring the heat, I'll bring the light. Ray gave Usoko a proud look before spreading her arms above her head, a massive ball of flame and heat forming like a sun in miniature, while at the same time, Usoko was trying to call on her light powers, only to find they weren't responding. Instead, black flames licked the tip of her weapon as an aura as dark as the void formed around the blade. What's going on? She exclaimed, her voice wavering ever so slightly.
I don't know, but you should probably get out, grimaced Ray. I can't hold this back much longer. Go!
Not needing any further encouragement, Usoko zipped upwards as Ray thrusted her arms down, the molten sphere hurtling into the ground.
False dawn!
Shouted the Oni as the entire island was engulfed in a bright light that could truly only be called just that. When it was over, there was a brand new crater where Ray had been standing, and for hundreds of feet around, trees had been blown back and burned. What few bugs remained after the area had been thoroughly scorched scuttled off, half dazed and no longer interested in a meal. From the center of the crater, Ray lay in her base form, unconscious but breathing, as Usoko discovered when she went to check on her. It took Emiko's assistance to haul her back into the cave. Once there, everyone took a few minutes to process what had just happened. The first to break the silence was Usoko, back to normal now, sobbing loudly over Nonami's body. It wasn't fair. First her mother, and now Nonami too? Why did it feel like the universe had it out for her? Sarah was weeping as well, her hands clutching at Nonami's. It was Emiko, teary-eyed as the rest, who noticed something odd. Nonami's mouth was moving, and her eyes were looking directly at her. Thinking fast, she grabbed the head and placed it onto the neck stump. She wheezed faintly as air escaped through the gap in her windpipe. She's alive? Cried Usoko in relief. For now it would seem, replied Sarah. Oh, Maria, thank God you're okay. She rasped. I think that's a hard trick to pull. I think she's saying blood, said Emiko. Nonami closed her eyes and attempted to nod in reply. A fun little voice actor trick. To try to do that, you gotta kind of talk while you're inhaling instead of exhaling. It's not easy or fun. You need my blood? Asked the Pinkette. Another weak nod. Oh, all right, declared Usoko, with only a fragment of hesitation. Then have it. Bending down, she placed her arm in Nonami's mouth, wincing as the vampire bit down and started drinking the blood. Usoko began feeling woozy, but she could tell it was working. The skin of Nonami's neck was reconnecting, as was muscle, bone, tissue, and more. Once Nonami knew she'd had enough, she relaxed her jaw. Usoko would have 2 new scars on her forearm, but Nonami one around her neck, but both would live. Thank you, Usoko, she wheezed. You're an unlifesaver. The Pinkette nodded as Emiko, seeming to read her mind, asked Nonami the question Usoko had been wondering. Why did you need Usoko's blood specifically? Is it because you're related? Exactly, coughed Nonami. Some excess loose tissue was stuck in her throat, but she managed to get it up. Blood regeneration can work with anyone's blood, but it's strongest when it's the blood of a close relative. Without a moment's hesitation, Usoko pulled Nonami into a bear hug, tears pouring down her face. I thought that she cried through ragged breaths. You were dead. Nonami slowly placed an arm around Usoko. Her nervous system was still reconnecting, and it would be a few hours before everything was back to normal. Still, she softly ran her hand through her niece's hair to help calm her. Could have been, she smiled weakly, but I'm not. Ray had woken up by now, and she immediately fell to all fours, genuflecting to Nonami. Isai-san, please forgive me. She wept, her voice she also wept, her voice quivering. If I... Nonami just placed a hand on Ray's shoulder, sighing. I already have. You're one of my closest friends, Kobayashi-kun, aside from Sarah. Please, stand up, it's fine. Ray nodded, standing up, and after a moment's pause, threw her arms around Nonami, wailed. Threw her arms around Nonami, wailing. Nonami, for her part, just let the Oni get her emotions out. They stayed that way for several minutes until the sound of running footsteps could be heard approaching. Bracing for combat, everyone save for Nonami went into fight mode, only to be greeted by the incredibly naked and even more feral looking than normal Christina, wearing only a large palm leaf she'd snagged over her lower half and covered head to toe in dirt and God knows what else. Both sides were equally as shocked, though for different reasons, but quickly stood down. Usoko, using her clothes beam, easily my most metrosexual attack, created an outfit for the werewolf, which she quickly put on. My thanks, Usoko, smiled Christina. Thank God I finally found you. Now, before I forget, I have a message for you. Her attention turned to Nonami. Immediately, her eyes went to the very noticeable seam on the vampire's neck, and Christina couldn't help but once again act as though she had personally failed the vampire. Nonami, already a bit tired of this, clonked her on the head. You said something about a message? Asked Nonami, steering the conversation back like a mother with a van full of sugared-up kids. What is it? Did something happen back at base? Yes and no, replied Christina, turning to face the Pinkette. To be honest, the message is for Usoko only. For me? Asked the now concerned Usoko. A million questions were now racing through her head. Did something happen back home? Were Kuriko and Sakura okay? Was there an attack? But when Christina took her aside and relayed the message she had been given about Usoko's heritage and, more importantly, about her mother, she couldn't help but burst into tears once again. Tears of joy, tears of rage, and tears of confusion, all mixed and are all mingled on her cheeks as she breathed the words aloud. Our mother's alive? Sort of. It's complicated, but essentially yes. At least according to the source. If what they said is true, then something, exhuming her, magic spell. The werewolf started scratching at her head, a sign her mind was racing. I'm so sorry. I forgot the rest. Usoko turned to her friends. She needed to know more, and she needed to know now. I'm sorry, everyone. I need to go and speak with Lydia. There's been a development, and Usoko fell to her knees, the weight of the situation, on top of everything that had already happened, hitting her like a sack of bricks. My mother is alive, she whispered. Everyone gasped. Let me go with you, offered Emiko immediately. I want to be by your side for this, Uso-chan. Please. Usoko only needed a second to think of the answer before nodding. Extending her hand out for Emiko to take, the Oni helped her girlfriend up, and the two said their goodbyes, with assurances that they'd see each other soon. With that, and with Christina in the lead, the three began making their way towards the beach, as the first rays of the true dawn began cresting over the island. When the trio arrived to the beach where they'd made landfall a few days prior, they quickly realized they couldn't just swim back to the boat like Christina had to get here. They'd have to fly, which meant Emiko would either have to carry 2 passengers, something she'd never done before and wasn't completely sure she could. Otherwise, she'd have to risk making 2 trips before the rocks could wake up and try to fight her. Eventually, Emiko realized that the first option would probably be the safest, and she switched to Shutendoji form.
Usoko rides on my back, she declared. You ride underneath.
Figures, shrugged Christina as Emiko's bulky arms wrapped around her. It only took about 10 minutes to make the relatively short journey to the Tingler, a trip Emmy knew she could have made in a quarter of the time without the extra weight. Still, she didn't mind in the slightest, as it was a help to her Usoko. The moment she touched down, Usoko jumped off and made a beeline for the communications room, radioing to HQ. Usoko here. What is it? Silence.
Lass, you need to finish each transmission with over, or they think you're still talking,
advised one of the sailors in the room. Thanks, smiled Usoko, adding into the microphone. Over. Ah, Miss Takibana, hello.
Oh, wait. Oh.
Ah, Miss Takibana, hello, came the tired voice of Madrid. She and Lydia had been staying close by the radio the past few days, sleeping in shifts while the other would stay up waiting for a reply. Thank God you finally got the message. We need you to come back ASAP. Over. I only got part of it, admitted Usoko. Christina forgot some, but the important part was received. My mom's alive? How? Oh, over. Another long pause. I said over, right? Whispered the Pinkette to the sailor, who nodded. She is and isn't, finally replied Madrid. It's odd to explain due to, and by extension, your nature as an angel. It would really be best if we explain this to you in person, I think. I'll send a helicopter your way. It should arrive in a few hours or so. When you arrive, we can discuss this in greater detail. Over and out.
That means she ended the transmission,
said the sailor when Usoko tried saying more. The Pinkette grumbled. So far, all she understood was that she was an angel? Somehow? And that meant her mom was alive? She relayed this information to Emiko, in hopes her girlfriend might know something. Well, if the stories are true, then yes, angels cannot die, said Emiko. It was said that in old times, when an angel was struck down, others would gather and resuscitate their comrade, no matter how grievous the injury. Her azure brows furrowed when she considered this more. But we know you're a dweller. Or at least, what, a quarter? So how could you be a... And then it all clicked into place. The wings, the powers, everything. Usoko, you may well be something unique, I think. A convergence of light and dark. There's an old Oni legend about such a being. That a warrior who walks the path of Kada and Ashmani would someday be born to awaken blessed Tralurk. Usoko gave Emmy a very dumbfounded look, so she continued. One of our most important gods, she explained. In fact, he is arguably the most important. Tralurk is the god of the land. Without him, the Oni would be lost, and not know what crops could be grown, what game was good to eat, and what wild foods were safe, among many other things in his purview. He is also one of the only gods shared between both Oni cultures without any significant divergence. Legends say many eons ago, Tralurk was betrayed by his brother, Ashmani, god of chaos and trickery, and was locked into an eternal sleep from which he could never awaken. His other brother, Kada, the god of light, hid his sleeping form away until such a time as he could be awoken. Remember when we were at the arcade last time? When I mentioned that dancing was for the worship of the gods? It specifically meant for the worship of Tralurk, in hopes it would awaken him. On an impulse, Emiko ran into the ship's library and began examining the shelves. She hoped that, given Captain Prince was a was a friend of her family's, that he may have some books on Blue Oni culture. She couldn't find any right away, but then had an idea. Hey, Ship! Tingler! If you can hear me, I'm looking for a book on my people. Any chance you can help? What felt like a gust of wind circulated throughout the room, blowing loose pages and papers around. Then from a shelf behind her, Emiko heard a loud thud as something large hit the floorboards. Turning to face the source, she found the exact book she'd hoped to find. Ogagopdus, the religious text of her people. Unlike in other religions, the sacred text wasn't usually kept by anyone other than the priesthood, though these days most Oni consider themselves agnostic, if not fully atheist. Emmy, though, still held to the old traditions. With great reverence, she lifted the tome onto a nearby table as Usoko came into the room. As if her fingers knew where the exact page was, Emiko turned to the story she just relayed to Usoko. On the page afterwards, there was an ancient art depicting both Trollark's betrayal, his rescue, and eventual reawakening. It was the third scene Emiko was currently interested in. On it, there was the fallen body of the god, half buried, while the demon Ashmani lurked behind a tree. Stood over the body was a figure in violet armor with 6 white wings. In this being's hand were 2 weapons, though the art was unfortunately too crude to determine what they could be. Still, from their relative shape, Emiko could only hazard a guess. The ancient's interpretation of a baseball bat and a shotgun, perhaps? When she showed the image to Usoko, telling the girl her theory, Usoko couldn't help but snicker. Me? A chosen one? Emiko, you know I would never disrespect you or your religion, but that? She pointed to the figure in the drawing. That's not me. It can't be me. Look, Emiko sighed. All I'm saying is there's a possibility. Beings like you don't really pop up that often. In fact, you're probably the first and only, considering Kirko has a different father. Usoko opened her mouth to argue that Emiko was just looking for patterns that weren't there, but she did have a point. Someone, a long time ago, probably longer than the Dwellers or the Overus had existed, had foreseen something like her existing. And she did have to admit, the weapon the being was holding over its head did kind of resemble her bat, she guessed. Their musings were cut short, though, by the sound of helicopter blades approaching. Making their way above deck, they saw a black helicopter slicing its way through the sky towards the ship. The fog had apparently been turned off while they'd been below, likely to allow the chopper to land unimpaired. Stepping out from the cockpit was Lydia's own little helper, Aru Sarugami. He bowed to the girls briefly before opening the side door. Getting in, Emiko took a brief look around. She hated flying when she wasn't the one in control, and this helicopter was exceptionally cramped. Still, she wouldn't let that dissuade her. Emiko had come to be by her best friend's side. Her girlfriend's side through this ordeal. She'd manage this. Usoko, for her part, seemed thrilled to be riding in a helicopter for the first time. As she took her seat, Aru handed them both headsets. The noise of the blades would be too loud for any of them to hear each other on the ride there, so they'd use them to communicate. Plus, they also muffled the sound as they took off and made their way back to Fumazaki. Back on the island, however, things were about to take a turn for the worst. It had been several hours since Usoko and Emiko had left, and Nonami was nearly back to full strength, thanks in no small part to Rei's generous donations of blood. As an Oni, her regenerative abilities allowed her body to create more blood faster than a human, though she'd need to keep a constant flow of protein and iron going through her system to avoid herself becoming too weak to fight. Once the vampire could walk again, she immediately declared that the remaining 4 of them would be exploring the temple Usoko had discovered their first day there. I believe we may find something of interest in there, Nonami explained, using her stone powers to create an image of the structure in the cave wall, while Ray used her flames to illuminate her. If nothing else, this could prove a welcome distraction from this. She couldn't help but scratch at the scar on her neck, which, though healed now, still felt uncomfortable. Like if she turned the wrong way too fast, it might come right back off. The vampire shuddered reflexively at the thought, before pushing it back to the furthest recesses of her mind. Hyoka had a question, it seemed, though.
Aren't we supposed to be practicing our powers? She asked. Like, I don't wish to be rude, but this seems kind of unnecessary.
I have to agree with Hyoka, nodded Sarah. Nonami, for as long as I've known you don't tend to make decisions lightly, but there's really no reason to explore that place. Unless there's something you aren't telling us? I just think it may hold some clue as to these totems, she half lied. In truth, Nonami was feeling the same compulsion she had the night before, only stronger now. As it didn't seem to be affecting Ray or the spirits, it must have been due to her vampirism, somehow. Regardless, the decision was made, and the quartet soon found themselves standing outside an incredibly ancient stone entryway at the top of a 30-foot flight of stairs. Ray was immediately drawn to the architecture, being a student of the craft herself. Kneeling down, she began examining the entirety of one of the intricate wall carvings.
These markings, they definitely resemble Oni aesthetics, she commented. See the jagged lines? And like, the overabundance of 70-degree angles are dead giveaways. It's these swirls that confuse me. Curves don't usually show up in our builds, red or blue. Harder to carve with our claws, though not impossible.
She stood back up and turned to Nonami.
Whoever built this was definitely either an Oni, or was at least influenced by them. I could spend days just examining this place. It's really fascinating.
Perhaps another time, replied Nonami, a bit anxious, though I'm sure you'll find plenty to look at inside. Come on. But when Nonami took one step past the threshold, she vanished. It looked as though the darkness beyond had simply swallowed her up. Instantly, Ray and Sarah both charged after her, disappearing just as fast, leaving only Hyoka standing alone outside.
Oh, crap baskets,
she muttered before following them in. Nonami was lost. Even with her vampiric sight, she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. She was already cursing herself for her incompetence. What on earth was she thinking, leading them all here? She had no idea what this place was or anything. She had taken no form of preparation, just waltzed headlong into what was very clearly a trap. As she continued to berate herself, she noticed the sounds of her footsteps had changed. Before, they'd been simply shoe on stone. But now they were different. Like she was walking through a swamp. A wet and sticky sound, and not one she enjoyed. Then the smell hit her. An overpowering, irony smell that should have made her mouth water under any other circumstances. Fresh blood.
What is going on in here?
She muttered.
Samantha.
Nonami jumped about 2 feet at the sound of the voice, whispering quietly yet harshly in her ear. It sounded almost familiar, and that name, an old code name of hers from the early 1900s. Gavin? She whispered hesitantly. Gavin Michaels had been a former ally of hers back almost a century ago, when she'd gone by the code name Samantha Lindsay. And that had certainly been his voice. Her and the others had been a close team. Gavin Michaels, Jeff Jackson, Jeremy Matthews, and Alfred Travers, all fellow vampires, had been like a second family to her in the days and years after her father had died. They palled around, exploring the world and doing what they could to help monsters and humans alike. But the voice Nonami heard couldn't have been him. He had died 70 years ago. They all had. There had been a skirmish with a pack of werewolves and everyone was pretty beat up. Nonami had been sent into a nearby village in occupied France to get medical supplies and a tarp to build a makeshift shelter from the sun. "You left us to die, Samantha," whispered the disembodied voice of Jeff. "You said you'd come back before the sun rose. You didn't." I tried, cried Nonami. "I was held up at a checkpoint. By the time I could get through, the sun had already risen." "You could have just gone through them," chided Jeremy. "They were just humans. Who cares?" A swirling of wind whipped around Nonami, sending the blood at her feet into her eyes, blinding her. When she wiped it away, she was no longer standing in the dark, but was instead somewhere else. A place she recognized, and could immediately feel a knot form in her stomach as she took it in. Holmesville, Maine. The town the Deathstalker had destroyed several years prior. All around the vampire, corpses were strewn about, some torn in half, some split open, with their guts spilling out, some missing large chunks of their bodies like bite marks. And somehow, all of them were alive, moaning and crawling, oozing, or otherwise making their way towards her. All she could do was scream. And on that cliffhanger, I think that's a good place to stop. Ooh, what's going on? I wonder. Spooky times. But, yeah, I'd say we're at about the 3/4 point on this book now. There's gonna be this is about the final act or so we're getting into. So, I hope you enjoyed. The next one of these, I'll probably do at least one more of these this month. I'd say if it's not up in 2 weeks, it'll be like soon after. You can't see it, but I'm shrugging. I will do my best to get one up soon. Until the next time, I hope you enjoyed. Have a great time. Take care. Stay safe. And sayonara.